So, as we know, it's becoming increasingly more important how we are storing and accessing our data. So, today I'd like to tell you a little bit about our journey to modernize our data storage, about some of the challenges we've faced, about some of the lessons we've learned, and some of the decisions we made along the way, as well as the reasons behind them. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and about Assure for some context. So my name is John Canada. I've been a certified AWS Solutions Architect since 2018, and I'm also the VP of Engineering for Assure. Asure Software provides human capital management solutions, primarily for small to medium-sized businesses. We build applications that handle payroll, time and attendance, tax, and HR, among others, so that our customers can focus on their core business. We service over 1.7 million employees from over 100,000 different clients. And with all that traffic, we get quite a bit of data. So what challenges did we face with our previous approach? So our former data storage solution of choice was Microsoft SQL Server. As we heard earlier, and as you all know, that can rack up some pretty hefty licensing fees. We were self-hosting Microsoft SQL Server on Amazon EC2. That led to a couple of other problems. Yes, it did mitigate some of the costs by self-hosting it, but then that led to a lot of extra infrastructure work for our team. We had to manage anytime we wanted to scale the servers up. We had to add additional storage. We had to add, the patching, everything like that. So quite a burden and overhead on our teams. We still had the Microsoft SQL Server licensing costs, and we had a few other problems. We had no scalability. We had to have peak capacity provision 24/7. We had single points of failure. I don't know about you guys, but I like being paid on time, so it's pretty important that our payroll systems are highly available. So we had to go back to the drawing board and see, okay, this is the database solution that we had, but what else is out there? What can we do better? And that's when we came across Aurora. So with having a managed database solution, like you've heard about and as many of you have probably implemented, it eliminates the need to have some of that management overhead. You don't have to patch anymore. You've got this solution. But specifically, we went for Aurora Serverless. And this allowed us not just to take advantage of Aurora, which cut off the licensing fees and already reduced costs, but it also made sure that we're only paying for the storage that we're using and the capacity as we're actually calling it. And so this pretty drastically reduced our costs. Just as an example, one of our most common server instance types before was utilizing, I believe, an R5 2XL on EC2 with Windows SQL Server. We changed that. That cost us, for one server, about $18,000 per year. When we switched that to that same workload to Amazon Aurora Serverless, we're paying about $4,000 per year. And that's just for one server. And when you've got hundreds or thousands of servers, obviously that adds up quite a bit. The other major thing is because we had such a drastic reduction in cost, and now we've got a more scalable solution, we're also able to afford to replicate those database clusters across availability zones, across regions, without breaking the budget. And so now we've got significantly more highly available applications. We've got multi-region clusters. And so if we don't have to worry about a server running into issues and shutting down, or even something like an AWS outage in an availability zone or something like this. So we've had a lot of great experiences with Aurora Serverless. It's also fairly easy to get there depending on what your database engine of choice was before. As was mentioned earlier, I think someone mentioned Babelfish. If you are coming from something like Microsoft SQL Server and don't have really heavily dependencies on stored procedures or triggers, you can use something like Babelfish to get into Aurora Serverless a little bit faster. In addition to how we're storing the data, another thing that was pretty important for our team is how we were going to get insights from it. So we had a number of different tool sets, as I'm sure many of you do as well before. We were trying to consolidate. We were trying to see what was our dashboarding and BI engine of choice going to be going forward. We ended up going on QuickSight for many of the same reasons why we went with Aurora Serverless. It is a serverless solution, so we don't have to deal with that management. It is also scalable. It's significantly more performant than our previous implementations, especially when you take into account the spice capacity. The performance is completely night and day. And it's also extremely easy to set up new data sources. This is very tightly integrated into the AWS ecosystem, and so adding something like we've talked about already with RDS, or if it's coming from a data warehouse solution, S3, any of those, it's extremely easy to get new data sources into QuickSight, and it's easy to set up pretty good-looking dashboards. It's got great documentation, and it's very easy to get very granular with your security. So you're making sure that your users only have access to the things that they should. So if I'm thinking back with the journey that we've had so far, the route that we've still got to go, and I'm looking at some of the key learnings, I would say take advantage of the serverless services where you can. I think a lot of companies have started doing that for the application side of things, really heavily using things like Lambda, like Fargate. That's fantastic. Would also highly encourage looking into Aurora Serverless, especially V2 and Postgres. When we had initially looked into the version 1 of Aurora Serverless, there were some scaling issues. It met demand eventually, but the way that it got there, it was a little bit problematic. The V2, from our experience, has been vastly improved. It scales with demand, and we have not seen performance issues in production. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause. Does anyone have any questions about serverless, about any of the technologies we've implemented, anything like that?
Why did you go EC2 Windows in the first place?
That's a good question. So we were initially on-prem. We went to the cloud, and I would say it was very much a lift and shift approach. Why did we not shift immediately from on-prem to RDS with SQL Server? It was the cost. So the SQL Server licensing fees were already killing us, and RDS is a fantastic solution, but when you add the licensing fees of Windows on top of that, it was going to skyrocket even more. So we opted at that time to go the self-hosted route. Mitigated the cost a bit, but then we still had all of the management overhead.
And if I could just add to that also, RDS SQL is a license-included service only. So if you had a license you had paid for, then you had the risk of incurring another cost. But in June of this year, we announced bring your own license with RDS as well. So now that's an option. But the other part is just, again, I was talking about financing mechanisms. We have financing mechanisms internally, actually credit mechanisms to offset the cost of the second license. It didn't exist when you guys migrated, but because we encountered it from a lot of customers, if you have license on premise, you're trying to bring a license to the cloud to a service that is license included, we can help you offset the costs.
You mentioned bringing data sets from other AWS sources. Are the schemas the same across those things, or what does that actually look like? We've been exploring something like that, but the schemas are radically different than one another.
So they are, but that's okay. So QuickSight has pretty much plug-and-play support for a variety of different AWS data sources. And so if you're coming from something like DynamoDB or RDS or Redshift, even with the different schemas, it's fairly easy to get your data into these dashboards. If you're using something like S3, what we've done is just put something like Athena on top of that to ingest it into QuickSight, with SQL-like language.